Hi folks, if you're in here already, we're just giving a couple seconds for people to get logged in. You can go ahead and open your chat window, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen, to find some information about how to purchase tonight's featured book and get 15% off when you buy through Greenlight before June 15th. Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. We're excited to host tonight's event with Stephen Haff presenting his new book, Kid Quixotes, a group of students, their teacher, and the one-room school where everything is possible. We'll be talking with D.W. Gibson, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to everyone for making this happen and to all of you for showing up. Greenlight storefronts are currently closed and locked, but our community is still here. Now, just a couple of housekeeping things. You can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot see or hear you. They will see your name over in our attendee list, and they'll see your name when you comment in chat or ask questions in our audience Q&A. If you scroll over the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a couple functions we'll be using throughout the event. One is labeled chat. You can say hello to the authors here, comment on any part of the conversation at any time, provide applause if you like after the reading or at high points in the conversation, and just chat with other attendees. There's also at the bottom of your Zoom window an icon labeled Q&A. This is where we'll be pulling questions from at the Q&A portion at the end of our event. You can type your questions there at any point throughout the event. And if you see someone else's question that you would really like to hear answered, you can go ahead and upvote that, and that will appear at the top of our queue as we're pulling questions. We are recording tonight's event, so look for video or audio versions on our website and social media channels later on. Tonight's featured book, Kid Quixotes, is available for sale from greenlightbookstore.com. Though our stores are closed, we're working with our supplier warehouse for fast direct-to-home shipping. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. And we're offering 15% off the featured book when you purchase it from Greenlight's website in the next week. Look for that coupon code in the chat. Our interviewer for this evening is D.W. Gibson. He is most recently the author of 14 Miles, Building the Border Wall. His other titles include the award-winning book, The Edge Becomes the Center, and Not Working. He shared a national magazine award for his work on This is the Story of One Block in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, for New York Magazine. His work has also appeared in Harper's, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Nation, and The Guardian. DW is going to introduce Stephen and his book, and then Stephen will start us off with a reading. After that, he'll be talking with DW and with all of you. DW, please take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Greenlight for hosting us, and what an honor it is to sit here talking with Stephen and the fine work he does. I'll do a brief intro so we can get to a reading from Stephen and then conversation. So Stephen is a person who is hard to put into a quick little bio. He does very interesting work, all centered around Still Waters in the Storm right now is the name of the program he's been running for many years now, a single classroom in Bushwick, Brooklyn, where kids of all ages come together to learn together and to be community for each other. For the past several years, they've been working on translating Don Quixote and also been working on a traveling serialized performance of the novel. But you know, even beyond that, Stephen was doing innovative work in education at Bushwick High School, or at least trying to do innovative teaching at Bushwick High School. He's a graduate of Yale's School of Drama as well, and has had a lot of experience in the theater outside of his educational work. This book is really hard to categorize. It does a lot of different things. It's the intersection of a lot of important issues in terms of community engagement and civics and immigration and literature and translation, so many topics. But as Stephen really aptly points out in the beginning of the book, there are three main threads in this book. One part, sort of a personal memoir about Stephen's experience with mental illness and dealing with that. Main part being Still Water in the Storms, the classroom where he does his educating with the kids. And the third part of that, the third important part of the book, the thread, is a young girl named Sarah, who's at the center of the action, the center of the performance that they put together. And I think that that might be a good segue to what Stephen's going to read for us tonight, which I think features young Sarah. Stephen?
Yes, thank you, DW. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. So I'm going to set up the context for the scene I'm going to read, and the reading should take about 5 minutes. So the time in this passage is the fall of 2016, just after the election. We're at Still Waters in a Storm, which is my one-room school in the Bushwick neighborhood of Brooklyn, a neighborhood of predominantly Spanish-speaking immigrants and refugees. 4 tables have been pushed together in the middle of the room. A group of kids, ages 5 to 17, whose families came here in desperation from Mexico and Ecuador, are sitting around the tables facing each other. The one rule in this group is everyone listens to everyone. 5-year-olds listen to 17-year-olds, 17-year-olds listen to 5-year-olds. Our ritual is the same in English, Spanish, or even Latin. Each person writes, then reads out loud as everyone listens. In this scene, we're working on our Kid Quixote project, which continues today, 4 years after it began. We're collectively translating and adapting the novel Don Quixote as a series of brief, bilingual, musical adventure plays. The kids are reimagining the story of a delusional old man seeking adventures in Spain 400 years ago as the stories of these children here in this neighborhood right now. The kids have been writing about voyages because Quixote is, after all, a road trip. One girl, Sarah, 7 years old, has been especially shy. She never reads her work out loud. This is her breakthrough. The only child not to read is Sarah. For the first 2 months of the Traveling Adventures project, she has been quiet during class. When asked to read her writing to the group, she has shaken her head no. Sarah has been coming to the Still Waters writing class on Saturdays since the spring when she was 6 years old, but she has yet to read aloud her own work, always asking a volunteer or another kid to read for her and to protect her privacy by not revealing her name. The Quixote group is about half the size of the big writing class, and there's nowhere for her to hide anymore. So she simply refuses. Then one day, in private, during a break, Sarah informs me that at her school, as she says, they're kind of rough on people. Everything you say is only right or wrong. She tells me that she sits at her desk in class, never moves, and never says anything. The school sent a social worker to inspect the house and interview the parents. The social worker asked if there is violence at home, but there isn't any. Sarah is just hiding, holding her mother's leg when faced with a stranger, or hanging onto her desk in class. At school, she doesn't know what is coming next. Play is not allowed. A vague threat of punishment for being wrong fills the air like humidity, and in her innocence, she is afraid. How do I help Sarah to be brave? I don't want to force her to read to the group. That could inflict trauma. I remember a story my paternal grandfather, Papa, once told me, a story that guides my teaching and illuminates this problem. At age 10, in 1917, he had won a bamboo fishing pole in a small town raffle way up in the mountains of northern Idaho. His father told him he would need to wrap the pole in thread, an intricate procedure requiring great patience. His father said that he himself needed to rewrap his own pole, too. So they sat side by side on the porch and wound thread around their bamboo poles. My grandfather added at the end of the story that, looking back, he suspected that his father didn't really need to rewrap his own fishing pole. Today, remembering Papa's side-by-side education and my father's tendency, as long as I can remember, to read whatever book I happened to be reading so we could think side by side, I sit next to Sarah as we write, and when it's my turn, I read to the group, showing her the way by making myself vulnerable. There was a time, I read, when I thought nobody loved me. I called the city's phone number for depression. A woman answered and said her name was Sarah. Our little Sarah at Stillwater's looks up, and there is that face again, eyes and mouth wide open at the coincidence of names. I read on. She asked how she could help me, and I began to cry. My mother had raised me to cry, telling me that whenever I needed to, I could let the tears fall and keep going until whatever was stopping me was washed away. And I couldn't stop crying for a long, long time. I cried so hard I choked and coughed, and boogers came out of my nose. The word boogers makes the kids laugh. But that grown-up Sarah did not hang up the phone. I kept repeating, nobody loves me. 2 hours of conversation later, after telling that Sarah that I had not left my apartment for days, eating only boiled eggs and saltine crackers and food left outside my door by friends I would not allow to enter, I agreed to go to the hospital. At the hospital, the psychiatrist, Heather, after listening to me for a long time, I don't tell the kids about the bandage on my wrist, told me she would rather have 2 broken legs than have what I had inside me. She promised me that I would feel better, but I would need to work very hard for a long time with the help of a therapist to understand my story. And she was right. The more I told my story, the better I understood myself, and the more peaceful I felt in my heart. I want the kids, especially the reticent Sarah sitting beside me, to know that here, in this room, in our sanctuary, it is safe to be vulnerable, which comes from the Latin for able to be wounded. Because here, nobody will wound you. Here, you can breathe. No one will drop from the sky and carry you away. After weeks of refusing and listening and watching with those bottomless black eyes, as other children and grown-ups read their stories, on this one day, this day of vulnerability, Sarah, daring beyond daring, raises her hand, is called on, and begins to read. My mommy rode across the desert on the back of a tiger. That's how she came here from Mexico. At first, nobody speaks. Then they can't stop asking questions. These questions are born not from doubt, but from a love of adventure. Really? Yes, really. She told me in Spanish at bedtime. How long did it take them to get across the desert? 2 weeks. How did they cross the border? They came to a very high wall. It went as far away as they could see, to the left and to the right. The tiger said, "I can't jump over the wall. You need to carry on alone now." My mommy said, "I know you can do it. You have very strong legs." My mommy held on to the fur of the tiger's neck. The tiger moved its head up and down and crouched and wiggled its butt. The kids all laugh. Every time they hear the word "but" with 2 T's or 1, they need to laugh. Then it jumped over the wall. My mommy almost touched the moon. The tiger said, "I did it." My mommy said, "Yes, you did it for sure." Then I say, "My cat moves her head up and down before she jumps up onto the refrigerator." "Wow," says Sarah, "that's high up." The kids have more questions. The room is jumping. How did they eat? The tiger knew where to find water and rabbits and cactus fruit and how to step away from snakes that were hiding under the sand. How did they get to Brooklyn? They walked all the way to Brooklyn, through the desert and the forest and the fields and the ghost towns and the swamps. Sarah speaks faster and louder as she goes, releasing a horizontal avalanche of words. Nobody tried to stop them? No. When they reached the city, they stayed on dark streets with not a lot of people. The shadows protected them. Nobody saw the tiger? Yes, strangers noticed the tiger, and they were afraid, so they called animal control. The tiger fought back, she says, rising up a little from her chair, with its mighty paws and long, sharp teeth, but there were too many animal control humans with nets and ropes and a dart that made the tiger sleep. My mommy said, "Bye," and she cried. Her tears made lines on her dusty face. Sarah is now speaking in tongues, possessed and transported by the visions she has inherited from her mother. My mommy was sad for the tiger and sad for herself. She missed Mexico out in the fields. She missed the dirt between her toes and the wide open heavens above, more full of stars than darkness. Here in Brooklyn, the buildings blocked most of the sky. The electric lights erased the stars, and her feet, still bare, were punished by the unforgiving concrete. The tiger cried too, quietly, as it was falling asleep, and said, "Goodbye." Animal control took the beast away in a cage inside a truck. There is an awestruck silence in the room. "What language did the tiger speak?" asks a teenager called Lily. "Spanish. My mom didn't know English then." "Time's up for today," I say. "Thank you, Sarah. Good job, everyone. See you next time." As the kids walk out the door, they look stunned, as if they had just met God. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, so much packed into that passage. It captures a lot of what goes on throughout the book. One of the things that really stands out to me in the book and in that passage is, and you use the word vulnerability, right?
Mm-hmm.
This plays a part, and I just think about so much of the work that you do with the kids in Still Waters in the Storm is about disarming. And disarming them in different contexts. So take, for instance, when you guys get into performative mode, you relieve the pressure of memorizing lines. You get on stage, you don't know your line, just yell the word "help," we'll give you your line. You even disarm the audiences, right? You go out there and you do sound checks in some of the performance spaces. You disarm the audience in terms of their own sort of nerves and anxieties in terms of how's this going to go? How are kids going to do in this environment, right? Hey, this is all fly by the seat of our pants. Can you hear me now, right? So you're disarming the audience. You're disarming the performers. I even think of a scene in the book where you're doing one of the first performance with the kids, in a Manhattan apartment, a very sort of nice, Tony apartment, as you describe it. And a lot of the kids' parents that are there, this is a very different environment for them, and they're sort of up against the wall and hesitant to take the food that's being offered to them. And you're sort of bringing worlds together that don't usually hang out together, Bushwick, Brooklyn, and sort of Upper Manhattan. And I think there's a little disarming going on there as well. I just wonder, I'd like to hear you talk about that and the importance of that in the work you do, because to me, it stands out as sort of a hallmark of the work you do, that disarming.
Well, yeah, I like that word. I hadn't thought of that word related to the work, but it's accurate. I think that I usually call it creating a feeling that we're safe. That like being safe is number one. If kids are going to trust each other, if they're going to read things they've written, thoughts and feelings of theirs out loud, they have to feel like it's safe to do so. And I think often in school, as I read in part of this passage, they don't feel safe for a variety of reasons. I mean, the most common one they would tell you is bullies. There are bullies on the playground, there are bullies in your class, people who will make fun of you if you speak out, if you're too enthusiastic, whatever the case is. It can be scary to reveal yourself in that setting, whether in a school classroom or out in the playground. So having them feel safe is also feeling safe from the ideas of right and wrong. Mm-hmm. And as Sarah said in this passage, at school, they're rough. Everything's just right or wrong. And she has told me a number of times over the years that what made the big difference in her coming out was that she didn't have to be afraid of doing it wrong. And once you lift that fear, and once she feels safe and like what she says matters and is not going to be evaluated and is not going to be graded or judged, then she becomes brave. And that works for everyone, including the grown-ups in the room and including the audiences, as you said. I think that's a great insight, because I want the audiences at this show to feel safe. Because anyone who's been to a live theater knows that you have a job to do when you're watching a play. Those people in front of you, they're right there. They're not on a screen, and they need you. So there's this implicit pressure to react a certain way, and will you like it or will you not like it? So I want to take the like and dislike out of it completely. The old thumbs up or thumbs down. I remove that completely. That's not what this relationship is about. This is about children telling their story, and that's how the audience can receive it, and they don't have to judge it. They don't have to say whether it's brilliant or it deserves 5 stars or whatever. They just have to listen to the kids' story. Just hear their voices. That's it. And then cheer them on for saying, good job. You were brave. You stood up here and you spoke your story, and people listened to you and you touched them. And so really it's about the relationships, right? So when you talk about disarming and safety, it's about creating trust and removing pressure, removing fear, so that people can just be present with each other and listen to each other. And having the audience before a show help us with whether the kids can be heard at the back of the auditorium or wherever we are. We're making them agents in supporting the children. So their job becomes, I think, really clear. So I like that thought of disarming, because I think we do come not with weapons to attack, although certainly in the world of theater, there are critics who sharpen their knives on the way to the show. But I think that if we change that relationship so that we are people who are listening because the kids in front of us are blossoming, they're showing who they are to us, I think everybody's more at ease, because they don't have to judge it. They don't have to say if it's if they like it or not.
Yeah. Yeah, and the way you remove those words, right and wrong. I know there's a passage in the book too where you talk about staying away from good and bad too, right? These very unhelpful, uninformative words that create sort of scary binaries, right? And
Yes.
take away freedom.
Yeah. So yeah, there are words that really don't give you much information at all. So if you're working on something, not this doesn't just apply to theater. I mean, this is in all cases when I'm teaching. I encourage the people in the room to take good care of each other. You know, that if we all are taking equal risks by telling our stories, by being vulnerable, then we can trust each other. And when you respond to each other, and it's very important what comes right after you've told your story. And so I don't allow anyone to clap. I mean, audiences at the show can clap because that's the tradition. But in class, after someone reads a story, no clapping, no snapping. And I don't allow them to use the words good or bad because they have almost no information. They carry nothing useful for a writer. You don't know what kind of experience the person had. You don't know what they were feeling while they heard your story. You don't know what questions they might have. There's so much you don't know. So then if they say they like it or they don't like it, or it's good or it's bad, or in the case of most school systems, oh, you got an A or a B for that, I don't know what that means. Mm-hmm. It doesn't help anybody to grow. You don't learn anything about your writing or yourself. You don't go back to your work with excitement to try to, unearth more insights. Nothing good happens after that, except if somebody gets an A in a class, they might go, yes, I got an A. Mm-hmm. But there's no information carried by that letter. Mm-hmm. So in typical classroom situations and in the theater, I think these evaluations, judgments, approval or disapproval are not only irrelevant, they're destructive. They freeze the person, and the person doesn't know what to do, where to go. The writer or the speaker doesn't know if anybody understood what he or she is trying to say. Mm-hmm. And that's hard because in most systems, in professional settings and in school systems, there is some form of a report card. And I really wish there weren't, because it gets in the way of people just hearing each other.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so much of what you just touched on too is, to my ear, about communication. And you said a lot of things there in terms of how the class operates, how you want the kids to comport themselves and interact. And it's simple and it's easy to understand, but it's hard to do. It's very hard to do. And I observed it firsthand when I visited the classroom, and throughout the book, I see you again and again be a really effective communicator, particularly in that passage you read, because there you are being vulnerable yourself, and not just about anything, but about mental health, and not just mental health writ large, but your mental health. Mm-hmm. And adults are so hesitant to talk to each other about that. We have such little capacity to do that. And, I can pick out things that make you effective on the page when you talk about it. You pick very honest and plain language. I think that's a big part of it. But what else? What else makes that possible? That type of communication where you open up to a small child about mental health.
You mean, what is it? What allows me to feel comfortable with that? Or
and what skills? Where do you? I'd like to hear from you. Like, what allows you to do that, but also like transferability for other people out there that struggle with those communication skills. Yeah.
Well, again, I don't want to sound too repetitive, but this idea of making everyone feel safe is that's the goal, right? Nobody's trying to solve anyone's problems. We're just trying to help them feel safe talking about whatever it is they want to talk about. So I remember when I first was teaching at Bushwick High School, I was told that not to allow the kids to write about themselves, And in fact, in order to pass the English Regents exam in New York State, they had to write 4 essays. And in none of the essays were they allowed to speak about their own lives, their own experience or feelings. They were strictly to analyze pieces of literature, you know, as if literature isn't about the human heart or the mind. Mm-hmm. So my frustration with that made me feel that, wait, what are we actually learning in school? So typically school is all academics. And academics, I know now, you know, after many years of an education that didn't help me appreciate this, I now know that academic studies can be beautiful, full of joy, you know, just like full of beauty. And that's not talked about enough, the nature of that. Like what do these studies teach us? Well, now in a typical school setting, as I've experienced it as a student and a teacher, we never learn how to take care of ourselves or each other. Basic human relationships. The only way I learned that, of course, I would learn it from my parents, but not everybody has parents who want to talk about such things. And never in school did I ever learn any of those lessons, although just by following the example of some very kind teachers, I thought, oh, kindness, that's a good thing to do. But school could be helping people understand who they are. And once they understand who they are, how to take good care of that self, and also how to have a healthy relationship with someone else. I can't think of anything more fundamental, more basic than that type of education. So when I realized that over the years, that kids were checking out of school, they were not interested, they were frustrated and bored and angry even, it's because there's no attempt to acknowledge that they as humans are present in the room. And the teachers as well. The teachers become like a delivery system for data. And no teacher who loves teaching wants to merely be a delivery system for information. Mm-hmm. And so once I realized this, that I was fighting a battle I didn't believe in. I didn't believe in forcing kids to study things that had zero content that reflected their own life or their deepest needs. So I thought, well, we really need to know each other first. We have to get to know each other. And that's when discoveries will happen. We will trust each other, we'll feel safe, we'll feel brave, and we will make discoveries. We will go on adventures together. So one day I found myself speaking to all the kids at Stillwater's, and I said, you know, really, what we do is listen here. I mean, yes, we write and speak, but everyone in the room listens to everyone else. Everyone, regardless of age, background, poverty, whatever, skin color, whatever people can cite as differences, everybody needs basic attention. Everybody needs someone who will listen with patience and care. And so I told them about my history in therapy and how I learned firsthand that having someone who was devoted to listening to me with patience and care changed my life, saved my life. And I thought, why only in therapy? Why is this like an add-on? Why isn't this at the heart of everything? Mm-hmm. And I also had taken a former high school student of mine to an AA meeting. And I was deeply moved because all they did at that meeting was tell each other their stories. And they listened and nobody judged. They just said, thank you. And that ritual saved lives. And then I thought, why only alcoholics? Everybody needs this. Everyone needs the feeling that they belong and that someone is devoted to them in the same way that they are devoted to someone else. Like this reciprocal attention, reciprocal care amounts to love, basically. So we're talking about, how do you practice love? How do you teach it? How do you learn it? How do you practice it? And then add on to that the sense of adventure that comes from being with comrades who share some of your interests and your desire for discovery. So I think those two things led me to decide that I needed to talk about what made me the most vulnerable. I needed to do that, to show the kids that it was okay to do that, that it was safe. And then I asked to listen to them. And I said, you know, really, we can remember how to do this. If we ever forget how to run this class in a way that works for all of us, just remember this simple phrase or statement: everyone listens to everyone. And if you whenever you get lost, whenever you get distracted or stressed out, come back to that simple idea. And then, of course, the idea is simple, but the implications are vast. Mm-hmm. If you apply them to education and politics and economics and all kinds of fields, if you start with that as your axiom, if that's your algorithm for working with other people, everyone listens to everyone, then the work becomes, how do you put that in practice and where does it take you? And it's all about this desire that we have as social primates to care for each other. You know, like when you go to the zoo and you see the monkeys picking fleas out of each other's fur, and they love it. You can just tell there's nothing better in the world than that. Well, we have that strong feeling, that deep need too. So that's where that came from, that desire and that decision that I would reveal myself to them in my vulnerability, because it's a matter of trust.
Yeah. And I think that you said so many great things there in terms of, I think that sort of the educators might use the phrase emotional intelligence, right? Sort of paying attention to how you're feeling, mm-hmm. right? And I think that the important thing about what you do to bring that into the classroom and your approach to pedagogy, it's not compartmentalized. I mean, we see on the page how passionate you got as a kid about math. And, mm-hmm. you know, principles your father taught you about math, and the sort of emotional reactions you pull out of the kids. It doesn't happen in a bubble. It's a reaction to Cervantes, to the translation work, to this word or this sentence. Mm-hmm. And that integration, I think, is really essential. It's not compartmentalized. They're one and the same.
Yeah, I think so too. And when in the Quixote class, you know, we can spend an hour debating one word choice. And because we're not under threat of being cut off if we don't finish it in time. You know, so another issue that touches on safety and trust is the idea of deadlines. Now, there are certain realms where deadlines are necessary, right? You're putting out a newspaper. There's a deadline for that. There are natural deadlines, like in theater. If once you agree that you're going to do a performance in a place at a certain time on a certain day, well, you have to prepare so you're ready for the performance. But a lot of deadlines that we deal with are arbitrary. And one thing my dad told me, my dad's a retired math professor. He told me growing up that his policy was, if somebody didn't like the grade they got in his class, that they were free to come back anytime. It could be a year from now, it could be 10 years from now. And if they could demonstrate to him that they had an understanding of the subject, he would change their grade. He said, really, what does it matter if they learned it this week or next week or next year? Really, what is the problem with that? So in the case of theater, as I mentioned, we have this natural deadline of there's an audience waiting for us. But that is a deadline that kids don't feel oppressed by or threatened by. because they have something they want to show and they have a strong desire to show it. So I don't know if that answered your question. Did I answer it?
No, absolutely does. Absolutely does. And I, you know, another thing that's sort of tethered to this is this idea of control. And I know you had a fantastic conversation earlier with James Wood, and you guys had a fantastic back and forth about the issue of control in a classroom. And I encourage everyone to check that out. And I feel like, you know, so much of what you do is about pushing back on the idea that conventional secondary education, all education gives in America, that it's about controlling the classroom, right? Keeping everything orderly, seats in a row, everything sort of going as planned, checking off boxes. And you only have this one rule, right? Everyone listens and is heard. And that is the extent of largely the extent of the control. I feel like the other side of that sort of absence of control is this idea that like learning is a lifetime enterprise, right? And I think this is another thing that adults tend to do. So much of what your book pointed out to me is how we fail as adults and how kids get so much stuff right. So as adults, we get to this, and especially as parents, right? You hammer it into kids. You've got to learn. You're in school. You've got to do this. You've got to do that. You've got to get to this point, and then to that point, and that point. And I think it presents this idea that there's some kind of race, and you'll get to a line, and you'll finish, and you'll cheer, and you'll feel great. But I think it, you know, I'd like to hear from you about your sort of attitude about learning as a lifetime enterprise, and how that gets missed as we sort of assign it to kids as something that kids do. And I'd like to hear from you about sort of your learning experience doing Still Waters in the Storm.
Well, one word that's very important in this conversation, I think, is pleasure. I mentioned earlier that, you know, I discovered a joy in intellectual pursuits. But in school, again, I don't remember ever hearing anyone say that the reason why you're doing this, the reason why you come to school every day, and the reason why we tell you to read every day, read, and fill out these reading logs and all to prove that you've read. They don't say do it because it's a pleasure. I don't remember ever hearing that reading is one of the great human pleasures. And that's a great reason to do it. I mean, I can give all kinds of justifications, you know, that literacy is empowering people who are disenfranchised, or people who don't feel they're represented in our country or our city. So if you have literacy, then you have learning, and learning is power. And yes, that's true. And also the argument that you alluded to, that you're studying in school now because in the future, you'll be able to get into college, and then you'll be able to get a really good job. So in other words, the experiences you're having now, here in this class today, only matter because 20 years from now, you'll get a better job. So what that seems to imply about the child's life is that the life they're living now really doesn't matter. They don't have to enjoy what they're doing. They just have to do it, because down the road, when they're allowed to live, they'll be glad that they did it. But what is so wrong with introducing them to the idea of the joy of this? But then again, if they're in competition with each other for getting good grades or for getting the attention of the teacher, that impossible job of one person with 30 kids, they're not able to enjoy what they're doing. It's turned into a fight. We're pitting them against each other, and the system pits students and teachers against each other. You know, as the representatives, they're the ones in the classroom who battle it out when the system has been created way beyond the classroom. They just happen to be the ones who are stuck there fighting with each other over it. And so, you know, kids need attention. Kids need to feel cared for. And I think that when they have that sense of safety, they begin to know the pleasure of reading. And if they love it, that is going to inspire them to keep reading way more than any recommendation about a good job in the future. They can't even imagine themselves as grown-ups yet. You know, they're being kids. So let them be kids. Let them develop habits of passionate fun, deep pleasure, and personal meaning. Make it about them and their lives and their friends and their families. And then later on, they'll have all these wonderful habits. And, you know, they'll be good at loving other people, and they'll be good at taking care of themselves. And they'll want to share all of that pleasure and joy with other people. Mm-hmm. So I guess it just takes a reimagining of what kind of experience we want for kids to have right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and that, so much of that joy of learning, and as it comes through in your book, centers on language, I think. Mm-hmm. And there are lots of sentences throughout the book where you reference sort of the joy of Latin and how much fun they're having with Latin. And obviously the kids are working with primarily with Latin and Spanish and English. And it's almost as though, you know, they haven't yet gotten to all of the jokes yet about how boring and mind-numbing that Latin is. You know, that all these cliches we develop over time, and you're sort of preempting those in this really productive way.
Yeah.
I'm, you know, the idea that you guys are working throughout with these different languages and even different interpretations of English, right? So in school, we're taught this is English, this is how it's done, subject, verb, object, right? But we come as we grow up, we learn that there's so many different Englishes, right? There's a different English in Mumbai than there is in the Bronx, than there is in you know, New York, other parts of New York, or whatever, you know, different parts of the world. Yeah. And so I'd like to hear from you about like how your relationship to language has changed as you've gone through this process. I know you were sort of, as I gather it, learning Spanish as you went along, certainly getting better at it.
Yes. Well, that's been one of the great gifts the kids have given me, they and their parents. They're very patient with me as I learned Spanish. I mean, I came in knowing French and Latin, so I had a boost to begin with. But they are so kind to me because I want to speak with them in Spanish, and I want to do it right. And they taught me, you know, it's amazing what I've learned, to the point where now I'm more comfortable speaking Spanish than French, even though I grew up speaking French in Canada. So, so that's been a great gift. And language is, you know, the vessel for all of our feelings, our ideas, all the subtle little things that pass through our minds. And for me, I mean, there are artists who work in different media, like some people work with paint and some work with a piano. And those are all languages too. Those are all ways of saying, this is what I carry inside me. And for me, it's spoken language especially. It's just always been a love affair I've had with learning as many languages as possible. Because when I speak those languages, I'm actually seeing the world in a new way every time. And I love seeing all the different facets of human life. So, so that's a great gift. And that's why I choose to work on language projects, because the idea of translation, I think, is fundamentally human. So, you know, the word translation comes from the Latin for carrying across. And so, you know, language is how we carry across what is inside us to someone else. And so that's fundamental to this process of trying to know each other, and that reciprocal listening that I talked about. It's all, the medium for all of that is language, and translation, you know, can be from one language to another, or it can be from a state of imagination to a state of articulation too. And speaking of the imagination, and this touches also on the whole idea of mental health, and talking about Don Quixote, that he's, you know, there's a lot of debate among readers whether or not he's crazy. And when you take that character, that old man, and you put him in and make him into a 7-year-old girl, then suddenly what might be thought of as crazy or sometimes pathetic or ridiculous becomes idealistic and imaginative. And so you can take part of that process is taking the words Quixote speaks and having this girl speak them. And just that act is an act of translation. Just that new voice and that presence of that little girl is translating a book from 400 years ago into the present. It's carrying it across from Cervantes, from Imperial Spain, all the way up to present day Brooklyn with Spanish-speaking immigrant kids. So language is our journey. Language is our path. And it's the way that we reveal ourselves to each other.
And I think that like the art of translation too, and I really do love this thread in the book, because I feel like, especially in an American context where there's such little translated literature, right? We have documentation of this, rough estimates, about 3% of the books that are available to American readers are translated titles. It's not a big part of our culture. And it's fundamental to the environment that you teach in. And it was fundamental to some of the work that you were doing, I would argue, at Bushwick High with Hamlet. Now you're working, strictly in English, but you had kids essentially translating Hamlet into their vernacular, language that worked for them.
Oh, yeah.
And that's such an essential, that's to me, that would help draw out the joy and sort of the ownership of the learning process.
Absolutely. So, your language is a large part of who you are, right? And how people understand who you are. So the kids I worked with at the high school, they actually really, once they heard, like I would read the Shakespeare out loud to them and they would hear it, and they're extremely sensitive to language. Like these are kids, one of my high school students, I remember one day seeing him on a street corner in the neighborhood with a couple other kids, and they were rhyming spontaneously, standing there on the corner, challenging each other to keep rhyming. And it was exhilarating to watch and to hear this. And the kids I work with there are language virtuosos. They got Shakespeare's rhythm. They felt that heartbeat, and they felt the sound of the words, how it felt to speak them in their mouths. And then, so I encourage them to rewrite scenes in the way that they speak on the street with their friends. And so they did, and they loved it. And they loved how the two different poetries worked together. And they had this sophisticated understanding that went beyond mine. It was a feeling they had for rhythm and sound that guided them on when they wanted to speak Shakespeare and when they wanted to speak street. And I learned so much from that process. And again, we come back to this idea that in school, they would be taught that the way they speak is wrong, right? They're not allowed to write in street slang because that's not correct English. So I used to tell them that I would never call it correct or incorrect. As you said earlier, DW, there are many Englishes. And I would just say, come up with another way of naming this that isn't correct or incorrect. You might call it school English or something, or test English. Like, here's the English you use on a test. And here's the English you can use with your friends or in our classroom, because I love it. I love to hear it. And to tell people that their language is wrong is like telling them that they inherently are wrong. Mm-hmm. And my current kids too, have had people come up to their parents, like in the grocery store, and say, speak English. When they hear them speaking Spanish, they're like, you're in America, speak English. And of course that's vile and stupid, but it's not uncommon that people think that way, that there's right and wrong. When there isn't really, there's just the way people speak in different places at different times. Right and wrong don't enter into it. A dictionary is helpful in some ways, but it is not the last word, so to speak, about speech. And languages only stay alive if they accommodate the street. Mm-hmm. If the vernacular is what survives. Mm-hmm. And even Augustus, the great emperor of Rome, he loved vernacular. He was in love with street speech. And he used it himself. You know, it was alive. It was full of imagery and surprises and humor and joy. And that's something I hope to convey, is that, you know, when you hear kids talking on the street, they love talking. They're in love with speaking those words. It makes them happy, and it makes me happy to hear them.
And they have joy because it's their language, and they possess it. And I think, even, you know, and we're just about out of time, but the one last thing I would throw your way is, you know, this problematic idea of assimilation in America with immigrant communities, right? And I think what you're talking about here touches on it. Like, we can reimagine what assimilation means, you know, and we obviously as a country struggle with multilingual society, as you've just pointed out, but even within the confines of English, we're so rigid. And so I think that what you're talking about here is tied to a bigger picture of how we envision immigrants and bringing them into the societies we're building, and allow space for their interpretation, their versions of English to be a part of how we you know, receive our language, our dominant.
Absolutely. And I think that, you know, when you take the time to listen to someone's story in that person's language, then you come to know that person in such a way that it makes it impossible to only see them as part of a general group. Like, if somebody wants to make generalizations about immigrants, you know, once you know somebody who has immigrated here, you know them personally and you care about them, which usually happens when you know their story, then it's impossible to say all immigrants are this way or that way. And you suddenly see that every human is a special case. Every person, everyone, regardless of their skin color, language, class, where they live, any of that. And once you acknowledge that every person is a special case, then it's really hard to promote injustice that forces any group or perceived group to be subject to any kind of injustice or stereotypes.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic place to end, and I think we're officially out of time here. So I'll pass it back to Chelsea at Greenlight.
All right,
Okay,
thank you. Yeah, thank you both so much for tonight's wonderful conversation, and thank you to everyone who spent this time with us tonight. Reminder, in case you had to miss any portion of tonight's event, or you have friends who unfortunately missed tonight's event, that it has been recorded. So keep an eye out on our social channels and our YouTube later on. We'll have that up in the next few days. And a reminder that you can buy Stephen's book through greenlightbookstore.com. And if you buy by June 15th, you can get 15% off with code Quixote. Thanks again so much, everyone, for coming out tonight, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good night.
Bye.